So this is the beginning of video number 4 here. And so the effects of the Industrial Revolution is changes in the work patterns. Um, you started working basically by the hour, and there was a lot of unskilled labor. When you worked on a farm, you didn't really work for the hour. You worked, all day until the job was done. But now you're paid by the hour. There's gender divisions. And so a lot of women are working outside the home now. They're working as maids or in the factories. There's used to be what you had was a family-based economy where everyone in a family group or an extended family group worked together. That's ended now. People move to the cities. There's urbanization. Once you get to the cities, there's all sorts of trouble with sanitation. We talked about what a chamber pot was, where people just went to the bathroom in a bucket, and what they did back at home was go dump it out in the field. Now that they're on the third floor of a tenement, which is an apartment building, they just took the bucket and threw it out the 3-story window. There's all sorts of issues with housing. There's segregation, maybe not necessarily what we would call racial segregation, but the rich are separated from the poor. Whereas out in the farms in the countryside, the rich and the poor, many of them, their places were intermingled. As you have more people in the city now and the conditions are bad, there's urban riots. You have the consumer revolution. Again, as I always tell kids, we tend to think of the Industrial Revolution as bad because we're looking at it from the standpoint of working in a factory. Doesn't sound very good to us. But in this situation, what's going on here is a lot of these people made more money working in the factories than they did working on the farms. So they had some disposable income. And now there's some light marketing going on. Now, just before spring break, we were talking about marketing, and one of my students told me they're watching Mad Men now, which has got me all motivated to want to go back and watch the whole season, all the seasons again. But I've got other things I'm watching. And reading and all that. But there's some light marketing going on. There's some fashion. There's fashion starting to come in, and so people have more disposable income. And disposable income, the little definition of that is when you've paid all the bills you have to pay. This is how much money you got left to spend on whatever you want. And then we have consumer goods, which are just that's where rather than just having some basic clothing to cover yourself, you can actually have a hat and a tie and cufflinks and things like that. There's some consumer goods like mirrors and vanities. There's some personal use items that are an effect of the Industrial Revolution because they're mass produced in these factories. A lot of them are very inexpensive. So again, this is an improvement in individual living styles. So again, this is the other side of the Industrial Revolution. There's the bad parts of it. Now here's the good parts. Next slide. 18th century economy. I'm not going to go over everything here, but under mercantilism, you had, government controlled trade and economy. Everything was designed to bring a favorable balance of trade. There's tariffs. Now, I did explain tariffs one day in class, and I'm pretty sure I gave you the Harley Davidson example from the 1970s. Also, because of this, there's the growth of slavery. And you should know at this point what the triangle trade is. The triangle trade, basically what you do, and we'll do it again in more detail later, is you draw a big triangle on the board between Europe, the Americas, North, Central, and South America, and Africa. And you've got basically a boat leaving England full of finished goods. It goes down to Africa, and it trades the finished goods for slaves. You load the boat with slaves, you take the slave over to the New World, and you unload the slaves, and you load up raw materials like cotton or sugar or something that's grown there in the New World. And so your ultimate objective is to have your ship never unloaded and never empty. It's always full, so you carry 3 cargoes. That's the triangular trade. Very similar to that is the Atlantic slave trade. What you have in the New World is these plantation-based economies. A lot of them are based around these super products or crops, sugar, tobacco, cotton. There's a lot of racism. There's feelings of superiority and exploitation of underprivileged groups. and the West is using its military, industrial, and political dominance over other parts of the world, especially in the Atlantic economy. The Europeans are dominating pretty much every phase of that, except as you notice in the picture here, most of the slaves are being captured by other Africans inside the continent itself. But they use what they call the coast method, where the African slave traders would bring the slaves out to the coast, and that's where the Europeans, especially the Portuguese, are getting involved. Next slide. Here's some of these wars. I'm not going to go over the War of Jenkins Ear. I've never seen a question on it on the AP European exam, not since we've gone to stimulus-based exams. We'll talk about the War of the Austrian Succession. That's a pretty big deal. Prussia breaks it. This is under Frederick the Great. This is actually an example of how Frederick the Great, even though he was considered an enlightened absolutist, actually, went to war to steal land from Austria. He was after Silesia. Make sure you understand this. And so Maria Theresa became the new ruler based on the pragmatic sanction of Austria. She's the Habsburg ruler, and Prussia jumps in, and there's this huge war. And look who is against it. Look who's fighting. France and Prussia are aligned, and they're going up against Austria and Britain. And notice the French, the Bourbons, are on the opposite side of the Austrian Habsburgs. Remember, there's all this hatred of the Habsburgs. There was the hatred between the Valois French dynasty and the Austrian Habsburgs. And now it's the French Bourbon dynasty and the Austrian Habsburgs. And there's this huge war. Frederick the Great almost loses this thing, despite the Prussians being such good fighters. And basically everything goes back to the way it was. It's a stalemate. And then after this, there's the so-called diplomatic revolution. And you see here in 1756. And this is where now, for the first time in history, you see the French and the Austrians, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs on the same side. That's why this is called the diplomatic revolution. They're actually going to be friends now. And the Prussians, who have this enmity with the British, are now going to be allied. But really, the main thing is now the French and the Austrians are friends. So if I ask you about the diplomatic revolution, 1756, make sure the main thing you mention is that the French and the Austrians, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, are now on the same side. So that is the War of Austrian Succession, not to be confused like I did earlier with the War of the Spanish Succession. We're moving on over to the 7 Years' War, and you're supposed to know a lot about this. The 7 Years' War is where these settlers, English settlers up in New York, are expanding westward, and they bump into French settlers. And the American settlers call the English for help. The French settlers call the French for help, and you get this war going on here. And this is the most important war between the English and the French in the Americas. It's more important in most respects in European and world history than the American Revolution, although it is going to lead to the American Revolution. You see here what this is. It's the French and the British, and Prussia instigates it. So this is called the French and Indian War in North America. In Europe, it's the 7 Years' War. The British win, but they're massively in debt. Okay, moving on over to the American Revolution, the British, they feel like they're justified in raising taxes on the Americans because the Americans are the ones who called for help. But this leads to the American complaint about taxation without representation, and that seems like a violation of Locke's ideas. And remember, Locke, who we have not spent a lot of detail on, but I did mention him earlier. Locke has this, idea that there's a social contract, and if the ruler is violating the social contract, the people have the right to rebel, and so the Americans are going to exercise that right. And the French are actually going to join the colonies versus the British, and obviously we need to do more on these revolutions and these wars, in detail. Remember, do not worry about the War of Jenkins Ear. The Enlightenment. Oh man, here's a big topic. Who are the people involved? Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau. So Locke we've talked about. He's the one that says people have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of property. Voltaire is this French guy. His name is Francois Marie Arouet, but he writes under the pen name Voltaire. He was not an atheist, as many people like to claim. He was a deist, but he's a hero to many atheists that I know. And he questioned things. He's the guy who said, no religion is worth burning your neighbor over. His famous novel is called Candide, which means optimism. Rousseau is the guy behind separation. Rousseau also believes in social contract, and Montesquieu believes in the separation of powers. Here's some more of these great thinkers, and I can't tell you all about all of them. Kant's famous quote is "Dare to know." David Hume, let me see. Seems like he's the guy behind skepticism. I may be wrong about that. I don't think it's Hume. Diderot published the encyclopedia. Cesare Beccaria, or Beccaria, however you say his name, he is the guy who writes about prisons and punishment and how, if you're enlightened, you should treat your prisoners better. Adam Smith is obviously the great god of the American economist. He is a classic liberal. And there's Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote about rights for women. And so here we go. What awakened to the problems of the times? Serious problems to solve them using reason. And there's all sorts of ideas the Enlightenment thinkers have: political, social, economic, religious. And here's the things they valued. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff in this lecture. Reason, science, progress, liberty, toleration, sovereignty, equality of individual freedom. Here's the time period of the Enlightenment. It generally goes after the scientific revolution. I always teach kids Renaissance, Reformation, scientific revolution, and then the Enlightenment. And going on concurrently with some of this is the growth of nation states. Happens in Western Europe. Basically, it's centered around France. Oh, and here you see here the scientific revolution, the Newtonian worldview, and that the earth is mechanistic. God set up these rules. At least that's what Newton would say. Many others wouldn't. They would say, it evolved that way. But there's these series of laws, and these people believe that if there are rules governing the universe, there may be rules governing individuals. And how is this thing spread? Through print, culture, salons, coffee houses. And I'm going to stop this lecture at this point to make it just a little bit shorter.